As shades of twilight fall on 2023, the net uncertainty of the global moment has never been more heightened. The world is grappling with two raging wars with heartrending casualties enmeshed with compounding polycrises amid a bleak economic outlook. Let's talk about the war in Ukraine that has had the world divided and has ushered in fundamental transformations in the global order. The question is, where is it going after 2 years? Recently, the two leading men, one fighting for influence, Russia's President Putin, and other fighting for survival, Ukraine's President Zelensky, held pressers in quick succession. They unveiled the larger geostrategic logic that is driving the neighbors to bet their entire agency for this war. If you hear them carefully, it is difficult to miss that while Russia's rationale is rooted in irredentism, Ukraine's rooted in international law. Now, there is no denying that West's resolve to support Ukraine as long as it takes has got diluted, with global attention turning to Israel-Hamas war, the looming elections in the US, and the unmissable subtext of declining public support for the war. All of it finding expression in stuck aid packages in the US and in the EU, with oodles of realpolitik negotiations being played out every day behind closed doors. Thanks to these negotiations, it is likely that aid would be released both from the EU and the US. But first, where do Russia and Ukraine stand today? This question often generates polarized answers, both of which are far from reality. As 2023 ends, Chief of Ukraine's armed forces, I'm sure you've seen that man several times by now, General Zaluzhny, himself acknowledged the counter-offensive to have reached a stalemate, what he calls a positional form. To drive the war from this current form with the current stage of warfare, he says that Ukraine requires air superiority, that is the F-16s, anti-mining capabilities, more drones, of course, and electronic warfare and reserves, and all of this most absolutely crucially in good time. Coming back, Ukraine's most stunning jolts to a far superior adversary have come from the ability to launch repeated attacks on Russia's Black Sea fleet in the Black Sea region, where Russia should have had the naval superiority. It's the preeminent power. However, Ukraine's attacks on Russia's naval capabilities, penetrating layers of air defenses, has been startling. From destroying the Moskva to attacking submarines to the destruction of the Novoscherkassk, which is a large landing ship of the Russian Navy very recently. They have been effectively using missiles and increasingly been using drones, and this has given Ukraine an asymmetric advantage. The logic is simple. Military procurement can take years, whereas drones can be made overnight and can also be tested in the battlefield directly. Exactly what Ukraine is doing. President Putin's decision to strike a likely deal with a Chinese company to construct an underground tunnel from mainland Russia to Crimea shows a rather tacit submission that he doesn't really expect the Black Sea fleet to be able to protect the Kerch Bridge, which, already damaged several times, is likely to be destroyed by the Ukrainians sooner than later. Ukrainian diligence to drive out Russia from that region and successfully resume the export of Ukrainian grains to the so-called Global South is a stellar example of resilience when Russia has withdrawn from the UN Turkey-mediated grain deal. Russia withdrew in July 23. Now, focus on Crimea also shows Kyiv's submission that it is virtually impossible to eject every single Russian soldier from Ukrainian territory in order to reclaim their internationally recognized borders of 1991. Their plan has been to inflict a massive blow to Crimea and make the war untenable. But this plan has not materialized in 2023. Details notwithstanding, it is becoming clearer that Russia is on the defensive in the Black Sea region, while the situation at the battlefront is pretty much stalemated in the favor of Russia. Moscow just captured the town of Marinka in the east, which, pretty much like Bakhmut, and I hope you remember the Battle of Bakhmut, holds little strategic value but cost both sides men and material, throwing Ukraine into the abyss of uncertainty as supplies from its allies have failed to arrive on time. Russia, on the other hand, is basking in its economy's resilience to absorb the damage of the sanctions in the short term at least by turning into a fully fledged war economy. President Putin is confident of winning the upcoming election and the one after that and the one after that. Basically, he's president for life. He also has the support of China and its proxies, of North Korea and Iran. Unidentifiable subsidiaries are making the oil trade evade price cap regulations. The sanction regime has not resonated with middle order powers' abiding preference for a multipolar global order, even when their weariness with the war and its aftermath has been growing lately. The most convincing war strategy for Russia, then, is to keep fighting a war of attrition until the Western resolve gets weaker, which perhaps, as some would argue, is already becoming evident. But it is unconvincing to imagine that these scenarios have not been thought through. According to a recently declassified US intelligence report, Russia has lost a staggering 87% of its total military strength at the start of the special military operation. If counteroffensive was a missed opportunity for Zelensky, these are not positive indicators for Moscow either and should not be merely brushed off as propaganda. When analyzed in terms of plain comparisons, the granular details of decisive military equipment like drones or helicopters or tanks, all this is anything but cakewalk for Russia, and I'll tell you how. According to estimates, Russia still has the capacity to fire about 4 million 155mm shells through 2024 with reserves and mobilized defense production with stockpiles reinforced by North Korea. On the other hand, all of NATO's combined efforts cannot produce as much for Ukraine. However, this disparity can be offset by the fact that being low quality and less precise, Russia needs almost 6 to 7 times the shells compared to Ukraine. All of 2022, Russia fired almost an unbelievable 10 to 11 million fires. This is significantly higher than what Ukraine fired. Kyiv was also able to economize better on the 155mm shells by deploying the Bayraktar TB2 drones and the FPV drones and resorting to rocket artillery systems like the HIMARS. For now, Ukraine is producing more FPV drones that are cheaper than NATO 155mm shells, but by most estimates, Russia will catch up by 2024. Both sides are adapting to changing realities on the battlefield, even though it may still not have as many skilled operators as Ukraine has. Further, several reports suggest that Russia is not able to produce the same number of tanks that it is losing in battlefield every day either. While Russia has undisputed air superiority with the glide bombs, etc., but it is not likely to remain calm in the skies when F-16 start getting deployed in 2024. Russia's unwillingness to resort to its formidable air power has been an unresolved riddle since the start of the war. So many analysts have tried to understand why. Either it's not so formidable, which I think is unconvincing, or Russia is saving it for the right time, perhaps. With significant losses to its helicopter fleet, Russia has also favored using drones for aerial reconnaissance and airstrikes. It is a drone versus drone situation where Russia would take some time to catch up, but I think it will. The only real advantage that Russian military possesses is the huge potential to mobilize human reserves. Even if the 700,000 number is doubted by analysts, the real number could be closer to 400,000. How did I come to this number? Interestingly, the 400,000 submission has been made by President Putin himself as a press conference. If you read the paper, you'll find the reference. Generally, though, Russia would not have a human resource problem because of attractive wages to soldiers that they are still able to mobilize to keep the momentum going. Ukraine does not have that advantage, and that remains the gaping loose end in the story of Ukraine's valor. While President Zelensky has announced mobilization, but it remains to be seen how it can match Russia's capacities. So, where will the buck stop? Ultimately, it is Europe that has to transform itself to support Ukraine. Unlike the US that seems smug in bleeding and weakening Russian military, Europe needs to zoom in better into what it wants from all the lives lost and guns fired in its own backyard. Does it want a winnable war that can culminate into effective negotiation to Europe's advantage? Or an endless war cascading into more wars and more conflicts with a blazing war economy in Russia? Popular opinion and alarmism regardless, Europe should be preparing for a likely return of Donald Trump towards January 25. For instance, while Germany appears clueless on how to manage the $100 billion promise to modernize its own armed forces, but it is clinically pursuing how to support ammunition production for Ukraine through revamped defense industrial initiatives. Although in classic inscrutability, it has still not decided to give Ukraine the Taurus cruise missiles it needs to isolate Crimea. France, on the other hand, is also ramping up its military assistance assiduously. President Macron will be in Kyiv soon. Sweden, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, all of these countries have announced not only military aid, but also joint defense production to cater to Ukraine. The war is far from being a done deal. I leave you with the question whether Ukraine will hold until then. I'm of the opinion that in all probability it will. But I will be back to discuss that and more. Stay tuned.